Good morning, 7 East. We made it. I've been waiting for this day. It is the Super Bowl 50 of Free Lepre Radio because it is our 50th episode. I wasn't sure if we'd ever make it this far, but we did. Feels like simultaneously 100 years ago and 100 seconds ago that we first started these broadcasts. And today is a landmark episode because it is the last day of new information in the 7th grade U.S. History Social Studies curriculum. So, think back to the very first things we learned about this year in the first week of school. Well, it all comes to an end now. Or should I say a pause? This is Act 1. Because Act 2 is next year in 8th grade U.S. History, which I'm sure you'll all love. But let us finish 7th grade first. And we will begin, as always, with our daily countdown first. And then to 1877, the end of Reconstruction and the end of 7th grade social studies. So first, today is Tuesday. You're listening to Free Lepre Radio, episode 050, our 50th episode. Topic for today is 1877, the end of Reconstruction. Your final assignment is basically just a review. Look over everything that we have done so far. Please make sure everything is turned in. I'm going to be calculating grades this week. Please check the grading requirements or criteria on Classroom. I give you a very case-by-case breakdown of how your grade is going to look at the end of the year. We still will be doing Free Lepre Radio broadcasts with different topics that are going to relate to just looking back and looking ahead. And our number of the day is 4 because there are 4 days of school remaining. Got that red intense font because it's a really exciting, thrilling countdown. Who knows what's going to happen when we get down to 0. Now, 1877, the end of Reconstruction. So, last time we talked about Reconstruction together, at least in terms of the videos, was the election of President Ulysses S. Grant. So with his victory in the election of 1868, General Ulysses S. Grant became President Ulysses S. Grant, and he restored the Republicans to the White House, and he took a firmer stand on Reconstruction than President Johnson did, who had a hard time working with the radical Republicans in Congress. So here we have Grant getting a little bit older, the beard getting a little bit thicker. And now, at this point, the South is resisting Reconstruction more than it had. With the federal government advancing the interests and rights of African Americans, many white Southerners began an organized effort to push back, attempting to find loopholes in the 14th and 15th Amendments that guaranteed African Americans equality under the law and voting rights for the men. Here we have this image here of African American men exercising the right to vote. Many in the South are going to try to find ways around this. The white Southern population that was in power during the Civil War and before, they're not going to want the changes that are going to come with African Americans having the right to vote. Suppressing the vote. So poll taxes and literacy tests were instituted to push freed slaves away from exercising their right to vote, as they were disadvantaged in these areas. Makes sense. If you're just coming out of slavery, you're not going to be able to afford a poll tax, and you weren't even allowed to be educated, so how are you supposed to pass a literacy test? The thing is, poor and undereducated whites with the same disadvantages were given an exemption to this rule, with grandfather clauses that allowed them to vote and skip the tax and test as long as their grandfather was able to vote. If you're a slave, your grandfather obviously couldn't vote because they were likely a slave too. So this is kind of the early discrimination to kind of ensure that African Americans are not voting. And discrimination does not stop or end there. Jim Crow laws. So Southerners opposed to racial equality, as guaranteed in the 14th Amendment, also wrote and enforced Jim Crow laws. These were laws that made it illegal for black Americans to use the same things as white Americans. Even after lawsuits saying this violated the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court said it was okay, in the case Plessy v. Ferguson, ruling that it was okay to force black Americans to use separate things as long as they were equal. And I have the unfinished sentence here, which they, have you finish the sentence, look at that picture. They often were not equal. So, separate but equal is not equal at all. And the Supreme Court is eventually going to come around to that ruling later, and Congress is going to pass civil rights legislation. But as you can see, they were not equal, even though the court made that a condition of the legality of these laws. Violence and terror. The agenda against black Americans in Reconstruction did not end with laws and regulations. It also turned violent, with formations of violent groups like the White League and Ku Klux Klan, which terrorized and killed black Americans as a way to intimidate them into not exercising their rights or living in equality with white Americans. It's a very famous cartoon. I showed some of it some of you it on the Google Meet from Monday. And the opinion of the cartoonist here is that African Americans are being put in situations that are worse than slavery during Reconstruction. They're being victimized by these two groups, among others. Now the U.S. government response. In order to protect freed slaves and make sure the South would follow the government's Reconstruction plans, the South was divided into 5 military districts before states were readmitted, and the U.S. Army was sent to occupy the South, acting as a kind of police force and protection for African Americans. So you can see the 5 districts in the bottom picture, and up top you see how the soldiers are being used to occupy the South and protect the African Americans from groups like the White League and KKK and others who are just upset at the gains African Americans are making out of slavery. Now the Grant administration falters. While President Grant was initially successful in using the military to keep order in the South and suppress groups like the KKK, his administration soon fell on hard times. Widespread corruption among officials in Grant's administration was exposed to the public and congressional investigations. So here is this famous cartoon of Ulysses S. Grant, and he's like a gymnast, and he's kind of resting on his hopes for a 3rd presidential term. But the thing is, he's being weighed down by corruption, it says. So these are different members of his administration who are basically breaking the law, doing illegal stuff. They're being corrupt, and all this information is coming to light at the worst possible time because a lot of the Southerners are going to use it as a way to damage Grant and make it basically impossible for him to continue in office. So things like people taking bribes, nepotism, which means like hiring family members and friends as opposed to people who are qualified. The government gets accused of all sorts of things, including President Grant's brother, as I'm going to mention. So even President Grant's brother was implicated in the corruption investigations. The whole thing caused so much drama and bad press that Grant decided not to run for president for a 3rd term. Instead, Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes would be the Republican candidate, also a great Civil War era beard. Now, it's clear that Grant, he's remembered more for the positive things he did in the Civil War and helping the Union win. As a president, mixed results. The corruption stuff really kind of damaged his reputation and his legacy. But nevertheless, for his role in helping win the Civil War, he gets honored by getting put on the $50 bill, even though it's the older portrait of him as president. So as a president, I guess not as much of a natural administrator as he was a natural leader on the battlefield. But now it is up to Rutherford B. Hayes in the election of 1876. So damaged by the scandals that occurred during the Grant presidency, and with voter suppression minimizing the black vote in the South, the Republicans struggled heavily in the election of 1876. The result remains one of the most controversial in U.S. history, as you can imagine from the title of this book, Fraud of the Century, and the Stolen Election of 1876. So why was it so fraudulent? Let's see. So this election was probably one of the most corrupt and hotly contested ones in history. Accusations, both provable and not provable, flew both ways concerning attempts to steal the election with voter fraud and dirty tricks. The end result was that 20 electoral votes could not be counted due to accusations of fraud. And as you can see how close the margin was, 20 votes could have swung the election either way. So in response to this, the government set up a bipartisan, meaning members of both parties, electoral commission to settle the election. And the result was that they gave Hayes the victory by 1 electoral vote, despite Tilden, the Democratic candidate, winning the popular vote. The result did not come easy, and it came at a price. So the Republicans hang on to the White House, barely, by 1 electoral vote, and popular vote is actually won by the Democrats. So you can see how the South has just gone back to being Democrat. A lot of that has to do with voter suppression. Freed slaves who had been voting Republican at the time had their vote suppressed, and as a result, a lot of these states went back to favor candidates in the Democratic Party who were more sympathetic to the South. But this election was extremely corrupt, and it doesn't even really end with the voters deciding. It ends with the commission deciding. So the commission decided that Hayes, the Republican, is going to be the president, but at this cost. Compromise of 1877. Compromise of 1877 was the informal way Congress resolved the election of 1876. The basic agreement was this: Hayes would become president, and in exchange, the government would remove the soldiers occupying the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. So Reconstruction, basically over. The U.S. troops leave the South. So when we look back at Reconstruction, here's what we need to consider. Reconstruction has mixed reviews by historians, but most consider it a failure. Although African Americans made a lot of gains, the era did not turn out to make the progress many in the North hoped it would. African Americans were essentially left to fend for themselves after the military left the South, and this often meant being victims of oppression and violence. All of the states were reunited, but racial and sectional conflicts remained at the end and would continue for decades to come. So, Reconstruction ends 1877. This class ends in 1877. That is where we leave off for the year. Reconstruction is over. It's kind of not a very happy ending to the year. We have a civil war. The Union does win, but it doesn't exactly have the happily ever after ending. The president is assassinated, and the Reconstruction efforts aren't taken to their full potential, and it ends kind of with a whimper more than anything, and kind of in a negative way. And you'll pick up next year, and I'm going to give you some previews of what you're going to learn next year. But as for today, that is it for Free Lepre Radio episode 050. Hope you learned something new, because hopefully it's not the last time you learned something new, but it's the last new social studies content for the year. So congratulations on making it through. Tomorrow we're going to kind of look back and do the highlights from the year, and the day after we'll do a preview of 8th grade, right before our last day on Friday. This will be Mr. Lepre signing off. Have a good one.